Please help me welcome Dr. Dennis Marshall.
Evening, everybody. I'm delighted to be here. Can you hear me okay? Okay, good, because I'm a little bit deaf, and sometimes I have to speak loud even to hear myself. So if I get too loud, tell me to tone it down a little bit. I'm going to talk about conscience tonight and the freedom to serve. When Jim Clee called me, or he sent me an email and asked me to do this, I thought I'd come up with a fancier title than what I did, but conscience is it. And so we are going to explore that reality tonight. And I want to thank Father Don for his comments at the beginning about conscience after the reading, set up our reflections for what I'm going to lead you through tonight. Now I want to read you a quote from St. John Paul the Great, which reflects, I think, the crisis of our time. Now, crisis is a much used word these days and abused, but I'm going to define it a little bit later so that we can understand where he's coming from. But this, I think, from John Paul the Great, illustrates the kind of difficulties that we face in our present moment. He says this, quote, "When freedom does not have a purpose, when it does not know anything about the rule of law engraved in the hearts of men and women, when it does not listen to the voice of conscience, it turns against humanity and society." I submit to you that I think that we are experiencing a crisis in our world with regard to, especially in America, the HHS mandate, the redefinition of marriage, the lack of respect for life from birth to death. And John Paul II, when he spoke these words, he had not only Western Europe in mind, but the entire world in mind. In fact, our entire humanity. Now, as I said a moment ago, we use the language of crisis very frequently, and to such a degree that we've almost become immune to its meaning. Because we always think that crisis is something that happens to somebody else, right? Thank God I'm not undergoing a crisis. That's not what crisis means. Crisis means that we are confronted with a moment of judgment or decision that upon our making that judgment and decision is going to determine the character and the course of our life. In the Deuteronomy reading today, that's the perfect image of a crisis. "I lay before you life and death. Choose life so that you may live." Because if you don't choose life, then the consequences of curse are going to follow upon you and your family as a consequence of the type of crisis that you found yourself in, and you chose unwisely. This is a particular challenge then for us because we're confronted with the crisis every day in that sense. Christ is always offering us the invitation to come follow him. And do we answer that every day? Do we deny ourselves? Do we take up our cross and follow him? That's the perfect example of a crisis. Now, many of us in here may not be suffering from a crisis of faith. We may not be suffering from a crisis of a judgment in the particular sense here, but we live within a context in which we've lost our moorings, and the crisis within which we live is a moral crisis, and it's also a truth crisis. I want to illustrate this by giving you several examples and illustrating what I mean. A few months ago, I was driving down 131 towards Wayland, and I noticed that there was a billboard advertising the United States Marine Corps. Now, being a former Navy guy, and everybody should know in here that the Marines are just a department of the Navy, they're not really their own separate branch. I was paying attention to this carefully because here's this man dressed in his dress blues, and the caption on the sign says this: dedicated to a sense of honor. Now, as I was driving past that, it struck me that 30 years ago when I was in the service, the Marines were not dedicated to a sense of anything. They were dedicated to honor, to service, to courage, to fidelity. Not to a sense, but to a real thing. Now, this is important. It seems insignificant, but it's important to understand this, is that if I'm only committed to a sense of something, what if I say this? I'm committed to a sense of marriage. I'm committed to a sense of life. I'm committed to a sense of justice. And what if some of my students back here would say, well, I have my own definition of justice, Dr. Marshall, and I have my own definition of love and marriage, Dr. Marshall, and I have my own definition of honor and courage and all of these other things. The crisis that we face in this sense is the real crisis in regard to the fact that by dedicating ourselves or committing ourselves to a sense of something, we give the impression that we ourselves are the source of honor, that we're the source of fidelity, that we're the source of love, that we're the source of truth and goodness, and so on and so forth, as if we were the creators of those things, when in fact we're not. St. Thomas Aquinas tells us that the mark of truth and goodness is not that which comes from within us, but that which we attend to outside of us. And so consequently, for me to know what is true and what is good, I must know that which is outside of me, and ultimately the source of that truth and goodness. I place before you life. When God confronts the Israelites, he places before the Israelites himself the highest truth, a truth that I do not create. I do not commit myself, and the Israelites did not commit themselves to a sense of God. So everybody understand this. It's very important, because this is the beginning of what Benedict XVI is going to call the dictatorship of relativism. And that dictatorship of relativism is going to be manifested not simply in the fact that I may have my sense of marriage and somebody else may have their sense of their own, but it's the fact that in the ensuing confusion of, say, 7 billion different senses of something, that we're not going to be able to maintain any type of order whatsoever. And so sooner or later, somebody is going to have to step in and impose order on the madness, which is a relativistic view of the world. And so let me give you an example of that. Most recent, too. How many of you are familiar with Archbishop Coeur de Leon of San Francisco? How many of you are familiar with Nancy Pelosi, Senator Pelosi, taking him to task and telling him not to go to that march for marriage? Why? Because she says that contained within the supposed virtue of the march for marriage was venom, the venom of hate, the venom of prejudice, the venom of bigotry, and so on and so forth. Now remember, just a moment ago we talked about the person who's committed to a sense of something. That's a disorder. We are disordered from the truth. And we see the further confusion of that disorder of the truth in Nancy Pelosi's comments to the bishop, who equates what true marriage is with evil, with venom, and with poison for humanity. It's confusion. On her part, not on my part, not on Archbishop Cordileone's part. But what I find particularly interesting in this and subtle is that the senator can begin to bring to bear political pressure upon an archbishop as if the state is the author of marriage, as if the state is the author and the definer of the sense of things. And so consequently, we're moving out of the realm of the individual who has a sense of something to a social order that believes that that it is the source of truth and goodness and beauty and so on and so forth. And when the society itself comes to that point, then tyranny is not far behind. Because divorced from the truth and divorced from goodness, the only thing left is the will to power, by which we exert a force to make people conform to the definition of good or true that we see fit. And this is illustrated by the fact of the baker in Colorado. How many of you are familiar with this gentleman? The baker in Colorado a few months ago refused to bake a cake for a homosexual couple who was getting married. He was subsequently taken to court by that couple. He was sued into submission. And then the state of Colorado is forcing him, against his conscience, to bake cakes for homosexual couples who are getting married. This kind of coercion, this kind of loss of freedom, is indicative of the crisis that we find ourselves in at the present moment, and it is a crisis of conscience. Because, as you know, for the last 3 years, the Catholic Church has been standing against the HHS mandate of refusing government intrusion to impose a wicked morality upon the Church against her teachings, against the teachings of her Lord, and against her vocation to discipleship to that Lord. If the man in Colorado can be coerced, why not the Catholic Church? If the state thinks that it is the source of what is true and good, then why can't it even dictate to God what is true and good and to God's church? And so we're confronted with a particular problem, it seems to me. Now, this problem is exacerbated for us in the extent that I heard a disturbing statistic the other day about Catholics believing in the true presence of Christ in the Eucharist. Who has that number? Does somebody have that number? I heard an outrageously high number that said nearly 70% of Catholics do not believe in the true presence. Is that true? Is it that high? Father, is it that high? That's serious business, because even Catholics then are separated from that standard of truth. We have a crisis of conscience. Now, all of these things are important that I draw your attention to precisely because of this. Each one of us in here, and each and every person outside of this building at the present moment throughout the world, is created in God's image and likeness. That means that all of us in here have one fundamental goal in our life, and that is the vision of God: to know Him and to love Him. To know Him as the highest truth and to know Him as the greatest good. If we are disordered in our minds and hearts to where we can no longer recognize what is truly good and what is truly true, then, like those who choose death in Deuteronomy, are going to find themselves cursed. And so when Father Don asked the question just before we prayed the rosary, think about what's wrong with your world. What's wrong with your world? I'm what's wrong with the world. I'm what's wrong with the world. St. Catherine of Siena says this: if we were who we truly would be, then we would set the world on fire. I would be a saint, and you would recognize that without me trying to convince you otherwise. See how good I am? You'd be able to recognize that. And yet I'm a flawed human being, redeemed by Christ, called on a pilgrimage, stumbling sometimes, falling down frequently. And yet God calls me, and God calls each one of us to stand as a testimony to His goodness and His truth in the world in which we live. He calls us out of ourselves to recognize the good that we ought to do in the world. And this really, in fact, is the role of conscience. Now, a moment ago I told you that we human beings were created in God's image and likeness, and were made so that we might see God and love God as the highest truth and the greatest good. So to be made in God's image and likeness means that we are given by God as a gift with our existence a fundamental capacity to know good, to know that we should do good, and know that we should avoid evil. This is that still small voice that Father Don talked about earlier this evening. It is that capacity within us which orients us fundamentally to the good. Now, this capacity within us doesn't tell us immediately what is good or what is the highest good. That's why there's a second aspect of conscience known as the process by which we must educate ourselves in order to know what is truly good and so do it, and to avoid evil and to know what is evil and so avoid it. This raises a particular challenge for us because God, in His goodness, created the world, and because He impressed Himself within it, everything within it, insofar as it exists, is good. Now we have to ask ourselves the question, what is good then? The good, ladies and gentlemen, is what is desirable. Let me repeat that because it has real implications for us today. The good is what is desirable. Now that's a foreign definition to what our contemporary time thinks, because we think in our contemporary world today that the good is what we desire. Now notice the difference in the orientation here. If the good is what I desire, then simply whatever I want is what is good. My wanting, my desiring something determines its goodness. It makes me the source of what is good. It makes me the source of what is true. But how can I be the source of those things if I'm not even the source of my own life? How can that possibly be? So the good is what is desirable. It is what attracts us. It's what draws us out of ourselves towards it. It's what gets us interested in asking questions about it so that we may know it and begin to distinguish between whether it's really something that's fully good for us, that is, corresponds to our humanity, or something that is only apparently good to us. And we need to make those discriminations and judgments carefully, because the apparently good does not necessarily mean that that is something that is good for us. Because ultimately, what is good for us is that which helps us to achieve our ultimate end, which is communion with God. So the world is full of apparent goods, but not all those goods help us to achieve the highest good. And the only way that we can discriminate between those apparent goods which are only empty with regard to our ultimate end, and the ultimate end, which is our highest good, is to be in attunement to live connected to the ultimate end so that we may judge correctly. Let me see if I can say that a little bit differently, because I think it's important to understand this. In the Psalms it says that in God's light we see light itself. To only know the good and what is truly good, we must, in a certain sense, see through the eyes of God. We must live in attunement with God in such a way that we see the world in a real sense with God's eyes. Then we can judge appropriately the things of the world. Then we can choose appropriately in a manner that will allow us to live our lives in the dignity with which we're called as human beings. Let me put this a different way. We ought to seek to know God above all things and everything else in relationship to God. When we do that, then we see the world as it truly is. And we can act in it in a manner that is truly worthy of the dignity of our humanity. Does this make sense? Okay, good. So the whole process of educating our consciences is an attempt to penetrate to goodness itself so that we can choose in a manner that is worthy of our humanity. And when we do choose in a manner that is worthy of our humanity, then we're truly free. See, goodness and freedom are linked to one another. If I only choose what I desire, as opposed to what is desirable, then I am going to choose those things which imprison me, and we call that sin. True freedom is acting in a manner that corresponds with our ultimate and our highest end. Truth-telling, giving life, exercising mercy, being compassionate. These are the kinds of acts that we're called to by God, which reflect the truly free human being. The one who only acts according to how he desires limits himself to such a degree as to put himself in a prison that he himself cannot escape from. Let me give you an example of this. People often tell me that because I'm Christian that I'm not free, that somehow I am constrained in a real way by don'ts. I can't drink beer, I'm Irish. I can't cuss, I can't do this, I can't do that. All of these things that the world seems to think is important, they see my Christian faith being restrictive. But the fact of the matter is this, is that those who define freedom by acting according to whatever they want to do, ultimately act in a manner that contradicts themselves and it puts them in a prison. And the greatest example of that, of course, I'm going to use the most extreme example of that, is the addict. Freedom is not the ability to do whatever we want, but that's what our world thinks it is. But if you pay attention to people who are addicted, they're doing whatever they want, but they focus their life ever more narrowly on that one desire. so that their entire life revolves around the satisfaction of that one thing. And in their life being focused on the satisfaction of that one thing, they have in fact limited their life and circumscribed it in a very severe fashion. Whereas God, who calls me to the vision of His own glory and gives me the grace to be able to discern between good and evil correctly, means, quite frankly, that I'm open up to the entire world. I'm interested in the entire range of things within the world precisely because the good God Himself has created these things and bestowed them upon us as a gift by which and through which He displays His glory. So it's not the person who is in love with God and who acts in a manner of godliness that is constrained or restrained, but rather the sinner. That's why the truth of Christ is freeing. It's only the truth of Christ that can break through the narrowness and constrictedness of the lives of sin, of that prison of sin. And it's only that truth that can set us free to engage the world the way that it is. Not according to the way that I want it to be, not to make it into some kind of thing that I want it to be, but to truly serve the world in a way that corresponds with God's own intention. And this is going to be important. I'm going to show you how momentarily, but we understand that we have a capacity to do good and to avoid evil, yes? This capacity does not give us some magical insight into what is truly good or not. We also have to educate our conscience in such a manner as to be able to discriminate between what is truly good from what is only apparently good. Does everybody understand that? We also know that the only way that we can see what is truly good is to be attuned to live in harmony with the source of that goodness itself, God. He's the one who makes it possible for us to see clearly the things of this world and makes it possible for us to judge them appropriately in light of our ultimate end. Does this make sense? Good. I see you're all nodding your head. That's a good thing. So that brings me then finally to the judgment of conscience. We're not just thinkers, as much as I would love to say that we are. We're not simply thinkers and contemplators of the world. We're also doers. And this is what where the judgment of conscience comes in. What we know to be good and to be done, we need to make a judgment about that, and then we need to put that judgment into action through a decision. If we don't, then we only really act with one part of our humanity. We act with our mind, but we leave our will paralyzed. But we're to know God and we're to love God. We're to know the good, we're to do the good. And that's what the judgment leads us to. Now, this judgment of conscience, once I come to an understanding of what is truly good and what ought to be done, then I must act upon that knowledge. If I do not act upon that knowledge, then I am culpable for sin. Does this make sense? Right? If I know what the good is and I don't do what the good is, I'm in trouble, right, Father? I'm in trouble. Okay. Now, so this judgment of conscience is a very powerful aspect of our moral decision making. Because once I arrive at the judgment that this is good and ought to be done, then nobody can force me to change that judgment. Not even God Himself. So that when I act upon what I know, that action is truly mine. One for which I take responsibility, whether praise or blame. Does this make sense? Now, this powerful aspect of conscience, that no one can cause me to change my judgment once I've arrived at the knowledge of what is good and what needs to be done. Powerful as that may be, it's also limited. It's limited in the sense that the authority of the judgment that I make about the good to be done extends no farther than the tip of my nose. In other words, my judgment of conscience cannot become the universal rule for Father Don and everybody else in here to follow. That's a good thing, yes? It's definitely a good thing. Why? Because I'm not God. It's only God who establishes the law, right? The universal law that everyone must follow. And my judgment of conscience is my participation in God's rule. And it's an awesome thing to do it well. And it's a terrifying thing to make a mistake in judgment. Now, the good thing is that if our judgment to do a certain thing ends up being wrong, and it doesn't kill us, we can change our minds. We can go back and we can reevaluate where in our moral reasoning we failed. We can ask for forgiveness. We can rectify our knowledge, and we can resolve to do better the next time. This is a good thing, yes? It's a good thing. So the judgments of conscience that we make are the means by which we put our knowledge of what is true and good into action. And when we put our knowledge of what is true and good into action, we serve the world. Now notice I said serve the world. This language that I'm using is important because I live in an age in which people want to transform the world. They want to change it. And we ought to be suspicious of people whose primary motive for acting in the world is to change the world. Why do I say this? I say this because basically since the middle of the 19th century, when Karl Marx's thought began to take an ever-increasing predominant role in forming the knowledge of the cultural or intellectual elite, the emphasis of his thought is not on knowing what is true and knowing the good and doing the good. The focus of modern philosophy has been primarily about acting to change the world according to the preference, if you will, of the visionary. Let me give you an example of this, and I'm going to quote Karl Marx here. It's one of my favorite quotes of Marx. In his book, actually it's a collection of notes called his Theses on Feuerbach, he is surveying the history of philosophy from its origins up to himself. And you can almost get the sense that Marx is standing there looking in the past, looking at all of his predecessors in the philosophical realm, and he's got his hands on his hips and he says, you know, up to this point, philosophers have simply contemplated the world. But the point is to change it. And what did he want to change the world into? Into his own sense of reality. Into the vision of his own truth. Remember the Marine and the sense of honor, committed to a sense of honor, right? Well, Karl Marx, like the Marine who has his own sense of honor, has his own sense of the world. And it's a sense of the world that is not grounded in reality, because that sense of the world emerges out of his own, what we might call Promethean drive, to make the world into his own image and likeness. God calls us to attend to him, the measure of truth and the measure of goodness. When we live in attunement to God, when we act in a manner that corresponds to his goodness and thus the goodness of the world, then we truly serve the world. And the world, in consequence, is changed by that. But the focus is always first and foremost on God himself, on his truth, on his goodness. Not my truth, not my goodness. Because if it's left to my truth and my goodness, I am going to impose my truth and my goodness upon you by means of violence that will remove your freedom from you. I will take it from you. And in doing so, I will violate your humanity in a way that God never would. You see, God leaves us free to choose life or to choose death. And even in the midst of choosing death, he does not abandon us to that, but calls us out of that and ultimately redeems us from it. Thanks be to God. But if I force you to live according to my truth and to my goodness, then I will destroy you. And this is really the insight that John Paul II was saying. When folks do not know anything about the rule of law engraved in the hearts of men and women, when they do not listen to the voice of conscience, then that turns against humanity and society. And in my mind, we are deeply in the midst of precisely that kind of dramatic action. A dramatic action that I would have never thought that I would have been in 30 years ago. But this quote from John Paul II was from 1979. I should have been listening. Now, it's common to feel sadness in the midst of a crisis. St. Thomas Aquinas says that the passion of sadness is what we experience when we are confronted with an evil that we cannot escape. And in the midst of that sadness, it would be easy to despair. And in the midst of that despair, we would, of course, be in rebellion against God, which is not a good thing. Right, Mr. Ingram? Right. Thank you. Now, John Paul II also anticipated this. Now listen, this is from 1979. This is his language. Because confronted with the crisis within which we are now, we cannot simply allow the juggernaut of sinful and evil men dictate to us the course of history. John Paul II says this. He says, and so we will stand every time that human life is threatened. When the sacredness of life before birth is attacked, we will stand up and proclaim that no one has the authority to destroy unborn life. When a child is described as a burden, or is looked upon only as a means to satisfy an emotional right to a loving and united family, we will stand up and insist that every child is a unique and unrepeatable gift from God. When the institution of marriage is abandoned to human selfishness or reduced to a temporary, conditional agreement that can easily be terminated, we will stand up and affirm the indissolubility of marriage. When the value of the family is threatened because of social and economic pressures, we will stand up and reaffirm that the family is necessary not only for the private good of every person, but also for the common good of every society, nation, and state. When freedom is used to dominate the weak, to squander natural resources, and to deny basic necessities to people, we will stand up and reaffirm the demands of justice and social love. When the sick, the aged, or the dying are abandoned in loneliness, we will stand up and proclaim that they are worthy of love, care, and respect. If we're disordered, we cannot stand. If 70% of Catholics do not believe in the true presence of Christ, we cannot stand. Because the source of goodness, we are separated in that sense from the source of goodness and truth. In order to be able to stand against the depredations of humanity that we face today, we must be willing to place ourselves courageously at the service of God and to armor ourselves with the weapons of faith. We do that, quite frankly, like we did tonight, by adoring Christ in the Eucharist, by praying together, and then by leaving this building tonight, as on every Sunday, and being salt, leaven, and light to the world by standing up, standing against those tides of inhumanity that are beginning to overcome us.